This is my new Patreon series, number 39. I'm going to discuss the anti-Judaism, which is also known to scholars as the anti-Semitism of early Christianity and its Gospels and the inevitable consequences. We're going to look at the development of Christian anti-Jewish interpretation of the Jesus traditions that came down orally and were used to write the Gospels. Now, Paul, first, let's make very clear, was not the source of Christian anti-Judaism. Paul was not anti-Jewish. He was Jewish. This is an excellent book on the subject, The Origins of Anti-Semitism, Attitudes Toward Judaism in Pagan and Christian Antiquity by John Keizer. I would recommend it if you're interested in the subject. But Princeton historian, Professor John Keizer says, usually but not always, Paul seems to be saying that God has not and never will abrogate his covenant with the Jews. Thus, there's less evidence than is usually believed to be the case that Paul preaches that Christians replace the Jews as God's elect. This is only a later development, first taught by Justin Martyr, at least 100 years after Paul. Now, all four Gospels spin Yeshua's Davrim and Mashlim opposing the Jerusalem temple establishment into declarations and parables against the Jews. The anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish bias of the Gentile Gospels began with Marc's Gospel, which was composed a generation after Paul disappeared from history. It was amplified in Matthew and Luke about 20 to 30 years later and was full-blown in John's Gospel about 40 to 50 years later. And Gentile Christian anti-Semitism was probably fueled by four things: Jewish opposition to Messianic Judaism, which occurred after the time of Yeshua from maybe about 80-33 and onwards, and opposition to also Gentile Christianity, the failed Jewish revolt against Roman occupation in AD 70, the resulting Roman suspicion of all Jewish movements as treasonous, and so therefore Gentile Christianity had to disassociate itself from a Jewish movement, and Gentile Christian misunderstanding of Paul's gospel, which is very important in early Christianity. Now, beginning with Mark, all four Gospels frame Jesus' opponents and accusers and enemies as the Jews. If we take a look at the opposition to Jesus represented in the Gospels, the number of times the religious leaders accuse, criticize, and question Jesus as recorded in the Gospels, about 20 times for the Pharisees, 11 for the teachers of the law, and 7 for other Jewish leaders. Christian anti-Semitic interpretation of the Jesus traditions after the burning of Rome in AD 64 and the Jewish revolt of AD 70 became de rigueur. We call them anti-Semitic. They're probably better called anti-Judaic or anti-Jewish interpretation of Jesus traditions, which is ridiculous because Jesus was a Jew. He was not preaching against Judaism and the Jews. But in AD 64, Rome was set afire east of the Circus Maximus, probably by Nero, who wanted to clear the slums and wooden huts for his building projects. He deflected blame to the community of Christians who lived in the poor section. He had them rounded up and crucified in a circus, which was a theater, and burned alive, probably as entertainment and spectacle for his influential political friends whose support he needed, because the rumor was that he himself had burned down Rome and garnered a tremendous amount of opposition for that. Traditionally, the Apostle Peter was a victim of this event, and he asked to be crucified upside down because he was not worthy to be crucified like his Lord. The writer of Marc's Gospel, which is composed after AD 64, after this event, was a Roman Gentile citizen who deflected blame for the crucifixion of Yeshua from Rome to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. And that is probably why it was important to do that. After the Jewish revolt of AD 70, in their own self-interest under the Roman Empire, many Gentile churches needed to sever and disavow any connection with Jewish Christianity. So the sayings and parables handed down in Greek oral and written Jesus traditions in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which were written after AD 70, were interpreted and spun as prophecies by Jesus against the Jews for rejecting their Messiah. Matthew's Gospel portrays the Jews as Christ killers that God will punish. He says, when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but that instead a riot was breaking out, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood. He said, you bear the responsibility. All the people answered, his blood be on us and our children. So Pilate released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, has the most strongly, I wouldn't call it anti-Judaic, I'd call it anti-Semitic interpretation of the Jesus traditions and the Passion narrative, probably composed after Matthew and Luke, sometime from about AD 95 to 120. Beautiful gospel, we all love it, it's very poetic, but it is the source for Christian anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism. John's Gospel lumps all Jews together as enemies of Jesus. And I'm quoting now from a Wikipedia article, which is well written. It says, in the Gospel of John, the word Judaioi, the Jews, is used 63 times, of which it is used in a hostile sense 31 times, and no distinctions are made between Jewish groups who are all lumped together. The Sadducees, for example, which are prominent elsewhere, are not distinguished, and yet it was really the Sadducees that were behind the crucifixion of Yeshua, mostly. The enemies of Jesus are described collectively as, quote, the Jews, in contradistinction to the other evangelists who do not generally ascribe to the Jews collectively calls for the death of Jesus, except as we saw in Matthew. In the other three texts, the plot to put Jesus to death is always presented as coming from a small group of priests and rulers, and the Sadducees mainly. But, and I'm quoting again from the Wikipedia article on anti-Semitism and the New Testament, Gospel of John, well-written, well-researched article. But, quote, the Gospel of John has provided anti-Semites with grist for their mill. It is the primary source of the image of, quote, the Jews acting collectively as the enemy of Jesus, which later became fixed in Christian minds. An excellent book I'd recommend is called Christian Anti-Semitism, A History of Hate. By the completion of the New Testament, the basis for later anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism had already been firmly established, says the author, Nichols. So there are many anti-Jewish themes in the New Testament which eventually merged into what we would call religious anti-Semitism. This book I'm showing you, Christians and Jews, Faith to Faith, A Tragic History, that's put together by Rabbi James Rudin, contains some excellent essays and illustrations of this. One is an article by Rabbi Michael J. Cook, who's a professor of intertestamental and early Christian literature at Hebrew Union College. According to him, there are 10 themes in the New Testament that have been a source of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and I totally concur with this, so that I'm going to put them down. First is the idea that the Jews are culpable for crucifying Jesus, and as such they are guilty of deicide, killing the deity. The tribulations of the Jewish people throughout history constitute God's punishment of them for killing Jesus. So the wrath of God is upon the Jews. Jesus originally came to preach only to the Jews, but when they rejected him, he abandoned them for the Gentiles instead, which is completely not true. Yeshua never preached to Gentiles. The children of Israel were God's original chosen people by virtue of an ancient covenant, but by rejecting Jesus, they forfeited their chosenness, and now by virtue of a new covenant or testament, the Christians have replaced the Jews as God's chosen people, the church having become the people of God. So this is a theme that we find in the New Testament, not just the Gospels, but the writings of the New Testament throughout, and also later early Christianity. The Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, repeatedly portrays the opaqueness and stubbornness of the Jewish people and their disloyalty to God. So that is an idea that is in the Old Testament as prophets criticize their people, but in Christianity that becomes an evidence that the Jews are obstinate and stubborn and stiff-necked, and they don't deserve whatever they get from God, and they're disloyal to God. The Jewish Bible contains many predictions of the coming of Jesus as the Messiah or Christ, yet the Jews are blind to the meaning of their own Bible. Well, this is the idea that early Christianity cherry-picked verses that they could translate or actually transform into something that would appear to be a prophecy of a crucified Messiah, because that was the first criticism that was made of Christianity and of Yeshua himself, was that he was crucified, and that was the punishment reserved for criminals in the Old Testament, in the law, the Torah. But the answer to that was, oh yes, well, if we go back through the Bible, especially the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, we find these little passages that seem to indicate the idea that a future Messiah will be rejected and crucified. There are not very many of them, and they are, of course, not referring to Yeshua. They're referring to historical people that existed centuries before. But that's another anti-Jewish theme in the whole New Testament, that there are predictions of the coming of Jesus, and that yet the Jews are blind to their own Bible. Well, nobody knows their own Bible better than Jewish rabbis. By the time of Jesus' ministry, Judaism has ceased to be a living faith. That's the concept that's put through in the New Testament. Judaism's essence is a restrictive and burdensome legalism. Okay, well, that's Yeshua's criticism of the Judean rabbis who were his opponents, as opposed to Galilean Pharisees. The Judean Pharisees did have restrictive and burdensome legalistic views, but that is not the essence of Judaism, and that was just one faction, a very small faction of Judaism at the time of Yeshua. But the New Testament presents Judaism that way. In the New Testament, Christianity emphasizes love, while Judaism stands for justice and a God of wrath. That's another idea that's put forth in writings of the New Testament. And Judaism's oppressiveness reflects the disposition of Jesus' opponents, called Pharisees, the predecessors of the rabbis, who in their teachings and behavior were hypocrites, and woes on the Pharisees, etc. So that is another piece of how the New Testament puts together anti-Jewish themes. But I might say, in fact, the plot to kill Yeshua was carried out by powerful Sadducees and not by the Pharisees, whom Yeshua opposed. Now, the kind of religious anti-Semitism that involved violence against Jewish communities and synagogues and so on did not start happening with Christians against Jews until 4th century later. So early Christian apologetic from the 2nd and 3rd centuries was anti-Jewish, but it was not violently anti-Semitic. So we're going to look at Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trifle the Jew, which was written in the middle of the 2nd century, about AD 155, 160. You can find the information on Wikipedia, which describes the dialogue in this way. The setting is presented as a chance meeting between Justin and Trifle in Ephesus. Justin has just converted to Christianity from a philosophical background, and Trifle had just fled the disturbances in Judea. Now we must understand that Trifle is not a real person. Trifle is a literary foil, a literary fiction that Justin has created so that he can write a dialogue that's really a monologue showing him defeating the logic of the Jews who do not accept Christianity. So Trifle is a Greek name, and as I say, the character is probably invented by Justin as a literary foil. It doesn't represent historical Jewish opposition to Christianity. It simply represents Justin's idea of Jewish opposition to Christianity, but he was quite familiar with the case. So he quotes sections from the Old Testament scripture that were used by earlier Christian apologists to show that Judaism was now obsolete. Those kinds of things from the New Testament writings that we discussed in the previous slide. When Justin suggests to Trifle to convert to Christianity, dialogue becomes animated. Trifle criticizes Christians on a number of grounds, protesting that, quote, "These and such like scriptures, sir, compel us to wait for him who, as Son of Man, receives from the Ancient of Days the everlasting kingdom. But this so-called Christ of yours was dishonorable and inglorious, so much so that the last curse contained in the law of God fell on him, for he was crucified." He was hung from a tree. We've discussed that accusation made against Yeshua by Jewish opponents after his crucifixion. So early Christian apologetic was anti-Jewish, but anti-Semitism emerged later, probably in about the 4th, 5th century. We'll look at that. So as we continue with the dialogue with Trifle the Jew, Justin provides answers to each criticism that Trifle makes by quoting proof texts that Christians claimed prophesied a crucified Messiah. He then claims that the scriptures belong now to the Christians, not to the Jews, because they are the true covenant community. And he says, "Are you acquainted with them, Trifle? They are contained in your scriptures, or rather not yours, but ours." Trifle later objects, "Our rabbis laid down a law that we should have no intercourse with any of you, and that we should not have even any communication with you on these questions. For you utter many blasphemies, and that you seek to persuade us that this crucified man was with Moses and Aaron, and spoke to them in the pillar of the cloud. Then that he became man, was crucified, and ascended up to heaven, and comes again to earth, and ought to be worshipped." Here Justin is just giving a litany of basic Christian doctrine. So the conclusion is friendly. They come to a friendly, in the dialogue, they come to a friendly conclusion as two philosophers who were disputing over something might. And he writes, "But since," he said, "you are on the eve of departure and expect daily to set sail, do not hesitate to remember us as your friends when you were gone. For my part," I replied, "if I had remained, I would have wished to do the same thing daily. But now, since I expect with God's will and aid to set sail, I exhort you to give all diligence in this very great struggle for your own salvation, and be earnest in setting a higher value on the Christ of the Almighty God than on your own teachers." This is pretty much the way Christian evangelists and Christian evangelism works when it's not being nasty. After this they left me, wishing me safety in my voyage and from every misfortune. And I, praying for them, said, I can wish no better thing for you, sirs, than this, that recognizing in this way that intelligence is given to every man, you may be of the same opinion as ourselves, and believe that Jesus is the Christ of God. But it was later in Byzantine Christianity that the foundations for medieval religious anti-Semitism and violence against Jewish communities was laid down. In earlier times, there had been coexistence and harmony between Christians and Jews, and Jewish Christians and Christians. But by the 5th century, much anti-Jewish legislation had been enacted in the Byzantine Empire. Physical attacks against Jews and their synagogues occurred both in Palestine and other areas. Anti-Semitism, a modern term, suggests a racial aspect to the hostility, which was not present in the ancient world. The hostile feelings were religiously, not racially motivated, which as they were in the later 19th century and Nazi anti-Semitism and so on. Jews were forbidden to build synagogues and to study the oral law, the Torah. The Jews were said to be Christ killers, and anti-Judaism was the norm in preaching. This is a good book I would recommend from Text and Tradition, The History of Second Temple Rabbinic Judaism. I'm quoting from that here. Now from an article called In My Jewish Learning, I'm going to quote that Schiffman wrote. I'm going to quote this part. By the end of the Talmudic period, Christianity had taken up the classical anti-Semitic views that were to inform its relations with the Jews in the Middle Ages. Jews were able to resist only by comforting themselves with the belief that they were correct and that their suffering would end with the Messianic redemption. It was not until the Middle Ages, however, that the violence we have come to associate with anti-Judaism became a significant factor. In the 16th century, just to give you an idea of how radical anti-Semitism was in what we call religious anti-Semitism, not racial anti-Semitism, but religious anti-Semitism from Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic. In the 16th century, Martin Luther in 1543 published a tract called The Jews and Their Lies, which today is shocking in its venom and even for its time stood out as particularly cruel and intolerant. In the 65,000-word treatise, he calls for a litany of horrors, including the destruction of synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish homes, for rabbis to be forbidden to preach, for the stripping of legal protection of Jews on highways, for the confiscation of their money. The Jews are, wrote Luther, a base, whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, circumcision, and the law must be accounted as filth. So if you're interested in reading this, you can go to this website. So I'm going to conclude this presentation with a summary from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Early Christian thought held Jews collectively responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. This religious teaching became embedded in both Catholic and Protestant theology during the first millennium, with terrible consequences for Jews. Following many centuries of persecution and exclusion, the Jewish minority in Europe achieved some rights after the Enlightenment. As Europe became more secular and Jews integrated into mainstream society, political forms of anti-Semitism emerged. This is what we might call racial anti-Semitism. Jews were targeted for their ideas and their role in society. In the late 19th century, pseudoscientific theories that legitimatized a racial form of anti-Semitism became popular with some intellectuals and political leaders. All of these centuries of hatred were exploited by the Nazis and their allies during World War II, culminating in the Holocaust, the systematic murder of Europe's Jews. In recent years, there's been an increase in anti-Semitism in the form of hate speech, violence, and denial and distortion of the Holocaust. These incidents are occurring everywhere, but especially in the Islamic world and in the lands where the Holocaust occurred. In many Middle Eastern countries, anti-Semitism is promoted in state-controlled media and educational systems, and militant groups with political power, such as Hamas, use genocidal language regarding Jews and the State of Israel. The former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, repeatedly declared the Holocaust a myth and that Israel should be, quote, wiped off the map. In Europe, anti-Semitism is increasingly evident among both the far-right and far-left political parties, and in the United States, some Jewish students on some college campuses are confronted by anti-Semitic hostility. Violence targeting Jews and Jewish institutions continues around the world. Denial and minimization of the Holocaust, along with other forms of hatred against Jews, is now widespread on the internet in multiple languages. So that's a summary of the current state of the history and current state, I probably should say, of anti-Semitism in the world. And it originated in early Christianity as a form of anti-Judaism or anti-Jewish philosophical attack to defend themselves from and separate themselves from Jewish Christianity and from Judaism itself.